Okay, folks, round one in the books. About to play round two. It's 1:52. Round two starts at 2 p.m., so I've got a little bit of time. I drove over. I'm not too far away from a Habit Burger that I used to go to back when I lived in San Jose. And I drove over there thinking, oh, yeah, we'll get some of this. I don't have this very often. It'll be good. It closed. The building's totally empty. It's not like closed, like, oh, they're not open today. Like, all of the stuff is gone. So that made me a little bit sad. Luckily, there was a Chipotle next door, and I got a burrito bowl. And I shoveled a lot of that in my face, so, that'll be okay. Headed into round two. I think we're gonna have white this time. I hope. We'll see. Yeah, and I'm hopeful. We're 1-0. Hopefully we'll get to play another one of our King's Gambits. If we see D4 or sorry, D5 or C5, then we'll have to figure it out. I'm tempted to play the Smithmore Gambit, but I don't know it well enough to know how I'm supposed to respond yet. So that book arrives today, and then maybe that'll be something in my repertoire. Anyways, I'm feeling good. Spirits are high. I've got some Coke. I've had some food. Let's see how it goes.
All right, we are back with an analysis of round two. I'm playing white against Andy Ueduo Shu, rated 1387. So I figure I've beaten people that are rated higher than this, but these games often don't go well for me. But I figured, we got a shot here. This kid's about 12, so kind of the older you get without getting really, really good, the less intimidating you are, which is why playing me is always a delight for my opponents. Nonetheless, we have white, so we play e4, and our opponent plays c5. Now, going forward, what I'm going to be playing is the Smithmore Gambit, because I've got a book on it, and I'm becoming very familiar with some positions. I've started playing this online, and you just get crushing positions. But I was unfamiliar with that, and the thing that I was more familiar with, though not very familiar, is c3, the Alpine Sicilian. My opponent plays d6. So I play d4, c takes, and g6. My opponent wants a dragon bishop. Fair enough. I play knight f3, defending this pawn preemptively. My opponent plays bishop g7. I play bishop e3, over defending the pawn, eventually striking here. This ends up being a fine place for my bishop to be. Computer thinks this move is best. My opponent plays e6. This basically ends up being a sort of Shenanigan system, if you're familiar. Basically, when pawns are on e6 and d6, this is like a very solid but defensive setup for black. The computer doesn't necessarily think this is the best, but it ends up being somewhat difficult to break this down. You have to figure out when to make the right pawn pushes. Nonetheless, I play bishop d3 now. I want to defend this e4 pawn, get my bishop to the middle of the board, be able to castle. I think perhaps slightly better might be bishop c4, very marginally, but the computer thought bishop d3 was fine. It thinks that I'm about to pawn up in this position, which is kind of surprising. My opponent plays knight e7, which is a very passive developing move. Basically, they were like, okay, I'm not going to be able to develop with tempo on this pawn. I'd like to be able to play something solid and defensive. So I play castles. My opponent plays knight bc6. They want to get that knight out on the board. I also get my knight into the middle of the board, and they play castles. So you can see I have this very ideal setup. In a lot of games, if you could choose to have this setup or perhaps one where the bishop's here, you just control the center so strongly, right? If you look at it, the pawns control all of these squares in the center. The knights control all of these squares in the center. The bishops control all of these squares in the center. Basically, your avenue into the center is... Actually, it's not even there because the bishops cover those squares. So basically, I control every single square in the center of the board a lot. And my opponent obviously has a similar setup, but one rank back. So with the space advantage that I have, the computer thinks that white should be better here, if only marginally. So I play rook c1. We basically both have this open c file, and I'd like to take advantage of it. My opponent plays b6. This is an inaccuracy, but I think basically what they want to be able to do is to be able to develop this bishop. I think perhaps some of the responses here that are best are things that get your knight over here. Eventually this weakens this pawn. But in order for that to work, you have to get your bishop out, and it's not easy to attack that pawn right away, so I don't worry about it. I play a3 because basically I don't want his knight to be able to come forward into the board, and that's fine. My opponent plays bishop b7, and I play queen d2. Apparently on the last move, this was the best move, and it wants me to play more aggressively with h4, h5, basically solve back rank problems, get to the point where we're putting pressure on this king side, especially with this bishop no longer defending the center of the board. But I'm not really sure what to do in this position, so I'm we're just going to keep building up the center. Just keep improving our pieces. So we play queen d2. Our opponent plays rook e8. That sort of weakens some of the defense here, and again, the computer isn't loving it. Over the board, I I didn't see that this was like winning for me at all. I was just like, I don't know how to assess this position. Sicilians are hard for me. I don't know what's going on. So clearly I need some confidence here. I play rook fd1. I want to be able to like line up here, perhaps be able to make some pawn pushes. Computer does not love it. It wants me to play b4. My opponent plays rook c8, and now I play b4. So we kind of end up in the same position via transposition. And my opponent apparently should play a6 to play b5. Basically, they don't want my bishop or my knight to be able to get in here. Probably better for the knight. Anyways, my opponent plays queen d7. So right now we have about a pawn and a half advantage. So again, this position is good for us. We control a lot of the center, but the question is, how are we going to break through? There are several different plans that I had, but the one that I saw is now that his queen has moved up, like this pin is actually going to be pretty annoying for our opponent. So the thing I thought is, okay, well, if I can like force my opponent to like move their pawns over here, this bishop has like no other avenues of attack beyond this diagonal. If I can ever close this down, then this bishop's just going to be stuck here because it's not like this rook is going to move. So I play bishop b5. The computer does not like this, but this was the exact continuation that I saw. a6, bishop a4, b5, and bishop b3. I didn't want to block my rook. And the computer says that I've lost about a half a pawn advantage, but I felt pretty all right about this because now if my opponent ever pushes the f pawn, there are tactics on this e6 pawn. So my opponent plays rook c7. They want to double up along the c file, and I say that seems like a good idea. I thought about doing that instead of playing this bishop maneuver earlier, but I figured why not put his pawns on some squares that I like, remaneuver my bishop to a place where it's no longer blocking my queen and my rook, and then I can figure out what to do. My opponent doubles up, I double up, and my opponent plays f5. Now, it turns out there are several good moves here. D5 is good, E5 is good, bishop F4 is good, taking advantage of the pin, the fact that this is under defended, it's defended only by the queen basically, and so then like you have some extra pressure on the rook, so if you can force a bunch of trades along this file, then this pawn might end up getting undefended if queen ever takes. And the move that I played is apparently third best, but it's a little bit harder to figure out what to do. Now here's what I saw, and you guys can tell me whether or not you saw some of the same stuff here. Basically, what I saw is if I go knight here, I have two attackers on this pawn, right? My bishop and my knight. And if I can take here with check with the bishop, so say my opponent plays something like this, check, and then my opponent's losing their queen and in exchange. Like this is obviously really bad for my opponent, and so that's what I saw. And I only saw their defensive resource after I played the move, which is basically they need to defend this pawn again. Defending it with the king is insufficient for several reasons, but the easiest one is probably the dish that I can take here. The only move that doesn't immediately lose my opponent the game is knight d8, which is what they played. And so then I was trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? And again, I played the second best move, but we've gone from a position where I was plus, I don't know, I think in this position I'm what? Plus 2.5, something like that. And now we're plus 1.9. And after I make this next move, e takes f5, which is the second best move, we're down to plus 0.5. So like this is clearly like the critical space of the game. Now it turns out better to play here is d5. Obviously playing takes here fails to something like this. It wants you to play bishop takes d5, bishop takes d5, and then something like king h8, which does not seem great. And then rook takes, rook takes, rook takes, queen takes. And then just like look at how soft and open this king is. And I can basically just, it wants me to play bishop a8 here. Oh, never mind. That's a less good move after some time. It wants me to play here and force the trade of knights and just, I have two bishops. My opponent is a bishop and a thing. This pawn is going to be weak. As long as I don't get back rake mated, I'm going to be okay. Like this is obviously a good position for white. So that makes some sense, but I didn't see all of this. I was really struggling in the middle to try and figure out when to play d5 and e5, and I basically just got too scared to play anything. So I played e takes f5, which is like not the worst thing in the world. And my opponent takes back with the knight. Obviously the pawn is pinned, so they can't take back. And so if I play something here like g4, which I considered, it's too aggressive, it's too weakening for the king, but I was like, maybe I can do something here. Turns out I can't. So I just go ahead and play knight e2. I want to be able to open up here. And my opponent says, oh yeah, I'm happy to trade rooks here, no problem. Takes. I consider taking with the bishop, but this pin on this pawn seems to be good for me. These two pieces are frozen, and this piece is less defended than it is otherwise. Bishop takes is apparently very mildly better, but I played queen takes because, again, I like having this pin here. My opponent has a slightly better center, but this pawn is stuck. This pawn, I suppose you can push, but then you have a backwards pawn forever. Like, it's going to be hard for them to get this pawn duo rolling. So my opponent plays h6, says get that knight out of here. And the thing that I saw here is if I play knight here, my opponent can take. When I take back, that doesn't seem very good for me. I don't like this pawn structure, so I didn't want to play knight h3, or I didn't want to play knight f3. So something that I could have done is played knight e4, With the recognition that takes and takes is fine, I was a little bit worried that like this bishop was going to end up being a problem for me. You see something like this, for example, lining up here, and so then I have to defend this knight again. So basically, it wants me to like trade queens here, and this is fine, but it's mildly better for black. And so I was like, well, why don't I go ahead and solve the problem by playing knight h3? And the thing that I did see what my opponent's follow-up move here is. It's not the best move. They played knight h4, and this is apparently very drawish. And what it wants me to do here is play f3, which I considered, but I was worried about a potential sacrifice here. Now, this is obviously very good for white. Trading a pawn for 2 pieces isn't very good. But now my opponent's king is going to be able to step up and be very safe. And by contrast, my king is like stuck out in the open. And with queens on the board, I was not super comfortable with this. So what instead I did is I played g3. And I recognized that this weakened this square, but I was like, that's fine. I'm just going to go here. So I saw this, and I saw here, and I was like, what is my opponent going to do? I'm going to be able to trade this knight out by playing here, or by playing here. And so, like, no problem. And I forgot that my opponent could take this pawn with check, but I still didn't see this as... It was a little demoralizing, but I didn't see this as terrible. Now, playing king e1 is apparently slightly better, and just saying, like, yeah, the king side's, like, not great, but, like, the center of the board is not going to open up in a way that matters. But I played king g1, and that ends up being a fatal mistake later, but this is a somewhat worse position for me, but still manageable. My opponent plays knight f3 check, and I go back to king f1. Again, I saw that the same would still be true here, except I could put my king on d1, which is apparently marginally better. But then I was worried about some infiltrations like this versus here. It's like, nobody's going to come get this pawn, versus if I'm over here, then like, yeah, there are open files and stuff that my opponent can infiltrate on. So my opponent plays king h7. Now that they're done checking me over and over and over again, this pawn they need to defend. They don't want it to be hanging, and they don't want to play g5, because then the light squares are weak around their king. For example, if instead they go here, I can go somewhere like here, and like that's not the best move, but basically like now my queen is in the middle here. This bishop's not allowed to move. I can play interesting moves like push in here to be able to threaten this bishop, etc. So obviously none of those plans are great, but g5 would not be great for my opponent. To play king h7 makes some sense, and I play knight hf4, which if we turn on the feedback, that's a great move. This basically takes it from like losing to totally fine. And my opponent plays queen f7. It's pretty obvious to me that they want to go here to be able to break this pin. And so I play knight h5, basically thinking I'd love to trade off this bishop, and then I have the two bishops and a knight versus 2 knights and a bishop. But that seems great for me. So I do play knight h5, which is a small mistake. Basically, it goes from even to like minus 1.6, which I'm not a grandmaster, so that's not a huge mistake. It wants my opponents to play knight h2 check and force me to like run further towards the middle of the board, potentially on defending this pawn. But my opponent plays something much more reasonable, which is queen f5, trying to induce a queen trade. Basically, they're up... We have 5 pawns, they have 6 pawns, so they figure they can probably transform this position given the number of pieces on the board. That's probably true. Basically, if you're up a pawn and there's nothing else going on, it's probably a win for the side that's up a pawn, as long as it's not 1-0 in a very specific, like, defensible king position. And I thought, okay, we can trade queens, but my queen is defended. I really want to get this bishop off the board, so I played here, and that fails to the obvious queen h3 checkmate, which I just didn't see. So I just blundered mate in 1, which is not great. Admittedly, when I was in this position, I thought it was worse than minus 1.5. I thought that this was a really bad position for me. So, I was playing here thinking, okay, I have to get something going on, and then my opponent mated me. If we take a look at the game score, we can see I played 76.4, my opponent played 84.6. So this is not a great accuracy, but it's not in like the 60s or 50s where I'm just getting blown off the board. And you can see that for the entire beginning of the game, I'm garnering an advantage. And it's just a matter of the fact that I don't know what to do in this kind of Sicilian, and my opponent does. So I need to book up a little bit more. As I mentioned before, I'm going to be learning the Smith-Morra Gambit, so hard to complain too much. And then I even managed to equalize here, and then I just blundered a mate in 1, which happens sometimes. So a little bit disappointing, but I wasn't too dejected. Let's take a look at how I was feeling after the game. Actually, first, let's take a look at how this affects my rating, and then we can take a look at how I'm feeling after the game. Okay, so after round 2, we played an opponent rated 1387. We didn't win, so our rating goes from down to 1134, and our tournament performance goes down as well. So not quite as good, but we take it. Let's take a look at the graph for a second. All right, so after 3 games, you can see that after our win, we managed to gain points from 1129 to 1145. And then after losing the second round, we lost about 11 rating points down to 1134. So that makes some sense.
Okay, round 2 in the books against a guy named Andy Shu, rated 1387, something like that. He played the Sicilian, I played my Alapin. We ended up with like a really, really, really blocked middle game. The position wasn't really in my favor. I'm sure that there are some tactics that I didn't see. It was a position that I was completely unfamiliar with, and my opponent seemed to know what they were doing. They also showed up 5 minutes late, which was interesting. They seemed unfazed by it though. I ended up behind on the clock because I had to spend more time thinking. They seemed to think that the position was relatively easy. Nonetheless, we ended up in a really complicated position. Things started to liquidate, and then I wanted to, as part of a queen trade a knight for a bishop, and my opponent played checkmate by, instead of taking my queen, moving their queen somewhere else. And I was like, oh fuck. I mean, he didn't say that. I was a kid, preteen maybe, 12. I would guess 12. Anyways, rough game. I have yet to look over it with a computer. I'm curious whether or not I had chances or not. It was just very blocked up. I couldn't figure it out. There were too many candidate moves. Oh, sorry, not looking at the camera here. Too many candidate moves. It was too much to calculate. I need some lines that I understand in the Sicilian. Right now, the Sicilian is a really strong weapon against me. Anyways, now we're 1 for 2. Hard to complain. Already, worst case, we'll be at 1 for 4, which is hard to complain about. But next round, I'm sure I'll play black. And I've got about 45 minutes or so until I've got to be back in there. So I'm just gonna chill out. It's a little too far to drive home and drive back. So just gonna hang out in my car, relax. One of the kids playing on the board next to me was like, "Oh, last game you played well. Couldn't you have played this move on this certain thing?" And I was like, I have no idea. I was like, I'll have to think about it. I don't know. And he was like, yeah, maybe not. And I was like, I just don't know. I'm not saying no, but sure. So Pleasant Kid, I think his name was Joshua. I hope I get to play him, but he seems to be playing really well. So I think if we don't play in this next round, then our paths probably won't cross. But what do I know? He's right at about the same as what I am. Anyways, doing okay. Need to study some lines. Oh, we'll get there. Hard to complain too much. It's not like I've been putting in a ton of effort. Played a tournament, got COVID, played another tournament without really practicing. I just need some lines with more initiative. Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next game. You guys, I went and looked at the computer analysis. I was doing fine. I was playing great. I had like a +4 advantage. I just couldn't, and I was like, oh, the two moves that I could have played were pawn push or pawn push, like either e5 or d5, and both of them are good, and I couldn't figure out if either one of them was good. Ugh. So frustrating. I was seeing ghosts. Too complicated. Should have trusted myself. I spent forever looking at them and then decided to play something else because I was nervous. Man. Ugh. Ugh. All right, that's all I have. Thanks.